With all hands on deck, the Seahawks defensive line served as a catalyst in a 34-14 win over the Falcons. Did we finally see this group start to play to its immense potential? We'll be breaking it all down here on our Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12. This is Corbin Smith, host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Glad to be joined here on a Victory Monday edition by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to all the 12s who are listening in, whether you're tuning in from Forks, Washington, or down in Broncos country in Denver, Colorado. We greatly appreciate each and every one of you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. The Seahawks finally snapping their 3-game losing streak with a dominant 20-point win over the Falcons. We're going to have our Monday musings, our in-depth takeaways after revisiting the film, what stood out from that dominant road win at Mercedes-Benz Stadium. We're tackling Monday mailbag questions as well. It's going to be a jam-packed episode brought your way by our friends at Hillsdale College. Go right now to hillsdale.edu/lockedon to enroll. There's no cost, and it's easy to get started. Now for your lead story here on our Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks. It felt like it had been an eternity, but the Seahawks back in the win column and back in sole possession of first place in the NFC West with a 34-14 victory over the Atlanta Falcons. And obviously, Rob, we'll have a chance to talk about this more when we get deeper into the show. Offense started fast, scored 4 of the first 6 drives, and that was a big reason the Seahawks were able to win this football game. But I don't know that any position group set the tone more than Seattle's defensive line, particularly when we're looking at the second half and the way that this group was able to flex its depth. It was able to flex its versatility, and we really started to see Mike Macdonald have some fun experimenting with these pieces. And this will be an interesting discussion because you and I, we have a little different perspectives in how we like to evaluate football players. I'm going to be leaning heavy on the X's and O's, but I know from a personnel standpoint that you were excited by what you saw from Mike Macdonald and the defensive coaching staff with how they were mixing and matching players yesterday with all hands on deck in Atlanta.
Yeah, I specifically want to focus in on the 2 so-called newcomers. The trade addition of Roy Robertson-Harris, who I thought played a terrific game, number 98, set the edge like nobody I've seen set the edge for the Seahawks in quite some time. He completely reset the line of scrimmage on multiple plays, Corbin, and so very excited about what he was able to do. And, of course, the return to the field by the celebrated first-round selection, Byron Murphy II. He had, of course, a pretty splashy tackle for loss to anybody who was watching the television coverage. The analysts did a nice job of highlighting number 91, but he made several big plays. And we're going to be talking about the turnovers a little bit later in today's show. Of course, the 2 interceptions that everybody's going to focus in on the defensive backs who were able to make that play. When you watch when you watch those 2 interceptions on tape, however, you'll see that it was number 91, Byron Murphy II, who was able to get the pressure on Kirk Cousins to lead to those overthrows that resulted in the interceptions.
Yeah, this really was a game where you got to see just how valuable number 91 already is for this football team. I mean, they're 4-0 in the games that he plays, and I don't think that at this point it's a small enough sample size to just scoff at. This defensive line looked totally different, and what excited me in this game is the fact that Mike Macdonald was able to truly have the rotation that I think he is wanting to implement with the depth that the Seahawks have, because everybody was healthy. You had the newcomer and Robertson-Harris. None of their defensive linemen and edge rushers played more than 63% of the snaps in this game. And I think that's probably the sweet spot for most of these guys. Draymond Jones played the most at 63%, but he was able to get 7 different defensive linemen at least 27 snaps in this game, including Roy Robertson-Harris. When you have 7 players that you were able to rotate into the lineup that much, and all of these guys contributed positively to Seattle's effort, holding the Falcons to just 14 points on Sunday, I loved the way they were able to allocate those snaps out. But most importantly, what I was excited about is the way that they were using, and this will lean into your strengths, but talking about the personnel mixed with the X's and O's. And what really excited me when you look at the snaps yesterday, Rob, Leonard Williams, he played 9 snaps at the C gap. He played 2 out wide. Jaron Reed, he played 12 snaps in the 5-tech C gap. Byron Murphy mostly was playing his 3-tech position, but got some nose tackle reps. Roy Robertson-Harris played the majority of his 27 snaps out wide. And as you said, he was setting that firm edge. And Mike Macdonald has a history. He likes to have those 290-plus pound long-arm guys that can set the edge. Roy Robertson-Harris doing exactly what you and I envisioned when this trade was announced last week, that he was going to be playing that role so that they could keep Leonard Williams inside for the most part. And then you've got your 3 main edge players. Draymond Jones got 8 reps playing inside in this game, but he still played 38 out wide. Again, he played more than anybody. But I felt like with all those moving parts, it felt like the first game that we truly saw Mike Macdonald really understanding how he is going to mix and match these pieces to play to everybody's strengths. And most specifically, when Byron Murphy and Draymond Jones were on the same side of the formation, those two just wrought havoc against the Atlanta Falcons yesterday. They could not stop that mix, whether it was stunts, straight rushes. Draymond Jones, and I'll have a clip I play here in a moment, but he had a series or two in the second half that he just completely took over. And part of the reason he was able to do it is because Atlanta was dedicating so much attention to Byron Murphy II in the middle. Those two were just feeding off of each other, and got a really good explanation from Mike Macdonald on that, where Draymond Jones, a player that we have at times been a bit critical of, mentioning that he really is starting to figure things out, and the coaching staff is starting to figure out. And this is really for the entire defense, but for Draymond Jones figuring out how to best utilize him. Take a listen.
I think so. It's been a team process with it, and how it fits with the guys that have been available as well. You know, the Detroit game, we had to move him inside, which, you know, he did what's best for the team in that situation. I actually thought he played pretty well against Detroit. But this past game I thought was his best game, at least this year, speaking for this year, since we've been together. Played with great energy. Really took over the one series, I thought, where he had the TFL or the batted pass, and then I think he was in on a sack. And just excited for him and his progress. It seems like he's have some confidence and more on the edge in what we're asking him to do, and I expect him to still improve as we go.
The key word there, Rob, it's confidence. And you could see that particularly in the second half when the Seahawks were finally able to unleash this defensive line because they weren't playing catch up, and the other team was the team that was playing catch up. And you could see Boye Mafe get that strip sack, Derek Hall returning the fumble for a touchdown, Draymond Jones getting a sack, Leonard Williams had a sack late in the first half that led to a punt and that Geno Smith touchdown pass to DK Metcalf. Roy Robertson-Harris had a lot of plays that didn't show up in the stat sheet, as you mentioned, where he was resetting the edge. Getting to see all those puzzle pieces start to come together, I think this is the first chance that we really get to see what this defensive line can be, in part because the game situation really allowed Mike Macdonald, his coaching staff, to be able to use those pieces the way they want to in the second half of games.
Yeah, there's no question about it. I mean, the way that the game was going allowed the Seattle to, get a little bit more creative with their alignment. Getting off to the early start on the offensive side of the ball and getting ahead and forcing Kirk Cousins to have to kind of put the team on his back, because let's face it, the Atlanta Falcons were running the football very, very effectively, at least in the first half. But as the game wore on, of course, Seattle was able to tighten things up. But I love the fact that you're mentioning and showing, those of you watching on YouTube can see the way that we have it broken down here by the 7 different defensive linemen, and whether they were playing A back, B gap, C gap, or out wide. I want to highlight a player there in Boye Mafe who looked like he was basically playing almost exclusively wide, but the one C gap rep that he had actually wound up being the forced fumble that really kind of put this game on ice from a Seahawks perspective. He was lined up inside. Actually, on the radio call, Steve Vrabel himself, the great one, called it out from the jump that he saw Boye Mafe lined up inside. He gets that, of course, that rush, and it's the closing speed that you saw from Boye Mafe. In close quarters, you really see the 4.6 speed that he possesses. That's what kind of closed the gap there on Kirk Cousins, created the fumble. Of course, Derek Hall picks it up and shows his own 4.6 speed and racing off to the to the end zone for a touchdown. That to me is kind of goes part and parcel with what you were talking about before, with the way that Seattle is able to kind of mix and match their personnel groupings. You have these big, powerful defensive linemen like Roy Robertson-Harris, obviously like a Jay Reed or Leonard Williams, but then you have the explosive speed rush. That to me is exactly what we saw. Mike Macdonald uses such great effectiveness with the Baltimore Ravens, a squad that had a lot of really good players. He made them a great unit. To me, one of the most encouraging things about this particular game is the fact that, of course, it was on the road. It was going up against an offensive line that had bookend first-round offensive tackles. And then again, against a veteran quarterback. The Seahawks were not beating up on a poor team. They were beating up on one of the best teams, one of the hottest teams in all of the NFL. And that, to me, is the biggest reason to be excited about this, as you say, Victory Monday.
And as Mike Macdonald mentioned after the game, this is not a quarterback that's easy to sack. Kirk Cousins was in the bottom 5 QBs in the league for times he'd been sacked. He was in the lower, I think he was fourth lowest percentage of his pressures that were turned into sacks. I mean, he finds ways to quickly get rid of the football. This is not a guy that's easy to get to. The Seahawks got to him for 3 sacks. They also had nearly double-digit quarterback hits on him. And they forced the Falcons to stop running the ball in the second half, too, because the way that the game unfolded, it played into this defensive line. This was the thing that I was most encouraged by in this game. There was a lot to be excited about with the way the Seahawks played, easily their best game this year. But seeing the defensive line, all those different pieces, how they were able to utilize them, to me, that was the most exciting thing that came out of yesterday's win in Atlanta. When we come back, we've got a bunch of mailbag questions to answer here on our Monday episode. We'll get to that coming up next here on Locked On Seahawks. Locked On Seahawks is sponsored by BetterHelp. What's the first thing you'd do if you had an extra hour in your day? For me, since it's Halloween season, I wish I had a little more time to watch horror movies. The best way to squeeze that special thing into your schedule is to know what's important to you and make it a priority. And therapy can help you find what matters to you so you can do more of it. BetterHelp Online Therapy will assess your needs. It can match you with your own licensed professional therapist in less than 48 hours. So if you're thinking about getting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online. It's designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist, and you can switch therapists anytime for no additional charge. Learn to make more time for what makes you happy with BetterHelp. Get 10% off your first month at BetterHelp.com/lockedon. That's 10% off your first month of online therapy at BetterHelp.com/lockedon. History, economics, the great works of literature, the meaning of the U.S. Constitution. You probably studied these things in school, and even if you didn't, it's time for a refresher. Time and technology have changed a lot of things, but they have not changed basic fundamental truths about the world and our place in it. So our sponsor, Hillsdale College, is offering more than 40 free, that's right, free online courses, including Constitution 101, Introduction to Free Market Economics, The Rise and Fall of the Roman Republic, and a brand new documentary-style course on Marxism, socialism, and communism. All of Hillsdale's courses are self-paced, so you can start whenever and tune in wherever. Plus, you can go deeper with readings, quizzes, and discussions, or just enjoy the lectures. Go right now to hillsdale.edu/lockedon to enroll. There's no cost, and it's easy to get started. That's hillsdale.edu/lockedon to register. Welcome back to the Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This is your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined for today's show by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to all the 12s who are tuning in. Thank you, as always, for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. For your second listen, twice a day now, it's Locked On NFL. Make sure that you're listening in. Our good friend Tyler Rowland's got the morning espresso for you, the first show, and then the barber himself, Tony Wiggins from Locked On Jaguars, with the second show, both of them bringing all the scoop and insight. And of course, we've got all of our reliable insiders covering every NFL team joining the show as well. That's Locked On NFL now twice a day. Make sure that you are listening in on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast. It's time for our Monday mailbag. Rob, we got tons of questions from our valued listener, and I know you're going to enjoy this first question that we've got coming from Carl Coleman. How do you justify keeping Kobe Bryant off the field at this point? Is it the run D? What's going on here? After what we saw yesterday, I think this is a valid question, even when Rayshon Jenkins returns.
That's a good point. I think that Rayshon Jenkins has proven himself in the past to be a more reliable open field tackler, but that certainly has not been the case much of this season. And again, as we talked about, some of that was the fact that Rayshon Jenkins basically had a club for a hand. But at the same time, when you have Kobe Bryant, who led the Seahawks in total tackles against the Falcons, led the Seahawks in solo tackles, and of course had an interception as well. Corbin, you and I have talked about ever since the Seahawks made the former Thorpe Award winner, a draft selection a couple of years ago. I mean, he has an instinct about him that I think it just leads itself to big plays. And he did the exact same thing in this case. Now, Mike Macdonald, more importantly, has also kind of talked about that. And sometimes when you are a very versatile player, it doesn't allow you really to hone in on one position. I think it's very clear with the depth that the Seahawks have at the cornerback spot, and we'll talk about some of that young depth here a little bit later, that it is allowing Kobe Bryant to get settled in at that safety spot. I feel pretty confident that the Seahawks are going to keep Kobe Bryant in the starting lineup, and as you said, there's a possibility that even when Rayshon Jenkins returns, that Kobe Bryant's going to be the starter.
Next question here coming from Tori on Threads. If DK Metcalf has to miss a game or two and the Seahawks thrive without him, could that have a bearing on his future? I know that this has been talked about a lot today since the news came out that DK Metcalf has a grade 1 MCL sprain. It's possible he could miss a game or two, as this question is suggesting. But I'm not going to go as far as saying that, oh no, this completely destroys DK Metcalf's future if the Seahawks go out and have good offensive performances without him. You've still got Tyler Lockett. You've got Jackson Smith-Njigba, Jake Bobo. I know he had a big drop on Sunday, but still a guy that's been pretty darn reliable. They get some other young receivers that they like. For a game or two, they probably can get by. But this offense is not the same without number 14, who's currently second in the league in receiving yards, has 3 touchdowns this year, probably could have had more. There's been several close calls, but still, he has been very good for the most part. There haven't been quite as many drops we've seen in the past. And I thought yesterday you got to see just how dynamic that he truly is on the outside. I thought it was one of his better games overall. So, no, I don't think it dictates his future. If he misses a game or two and the Seahawks offense keeps humming, they're going to be very happy when he comes back, regardless of how much time he's going to miss. I don't think this suddenly, we had one game without him and we put up 28 points or whatever. We don't need DK Metcalf. No, the Seahawks are not going to be thinking that way, I don't think. Next question here from Hawkstrologer. Upon rewatch the film, would you start Mike Jarrell over George Fant and Stone Forsythe moving forward? So this, Rob, is assuming that Abraham Lucas is not playing in the next few weeks. It does sound like he's got a chance to return to practice this week, but until Lucas gets back, are you starting Mike Jarrell regardless of the status of George Fant and Stone Forsythe?
Not over George Fant. I think that George Fant is still a better all-around player. Now, look, I am very, very encouraged, Jarrell, and we're going to be talking about that here a couple of moments. But again, I just think that the reliability, the consistency that has been George Fant throughout most of his career, I think should allow him that starting spot over Mike Jarrell. I would, however, start Jarrell over Stone Forsythe, and I didn't necessarily think that was going to be the case. Again, Forsythe, his ability and pass protection, I think, is at least passable. But that said, this was a relatively soft landing spot for the rookie to play Mike Jarrell against the Atlanta Falcons team, as we talked about, was dead last in the NFL in sacks, and Mike Jarrell gave up a sack in this football game. So let's not make it sound like Jarrell is an all-pro at this point, but still, he did play very well. And again, I would currently have him as number 2 on the depth chart among the 3 offensive tackles that I think have a chance to be available. Again, I would have George Fant, then Mike Jarrell, then Stone Forsythe if all 3 of them were available.
The next question here coming from Alex H18105. Why are all of Ken Walker's runs out of shotgun? I feel like it makes it predictable. than under center, limiting Seattle's play action game in the process. So I will push back on that a little bit from yesterday's game, because I think that was something that we saw changed up yesterday. I loved the fact that Seattle came out and they were able to get some under center runs. And Ken Walker III had more success than they did against San Francisco early in the game 2 weeks ago with that. And then Ryan Grubb got some under center play action for Geno Smith. And we saw him hit a couple of those big plays. Look, the Falcons had given up 8 plays of 20-plus yards the first 6 games combined. They gave up 6 of those plays in this game alone, and 4 of them being pass plays from Geno Smith. 3 of those were on play action from under center. So I think Ryan Grubb is starting to realize, look, I can't run the offense exactly how I did at Washington, where we're running all this shotgun. We're going to have to mix in under center so that teams are actually going to take our run game and our play fake seriously, and we can play into Geno Smith's strengths. But up until yesterday, yes, this was something that was concerning me. We talked about it on the show last week, that this is the NFL. You got to have some mix in terms of your under center shotgun looks. You can't run a wide open 100% shotgun offense and have success in the NFL. You just can't. You have to have varying formations and looks, and you got to have the play action, particularly with Geno Smith. So it was an encouraging development there that we saw Ryan Grubb go to that in this game, which he should have, with the Falcons being the 26th ranked run defense going to this game, using that to open up some of those big plays in the play action game. Xavier Mitchell tweets, Jackson Smith-Njigba feels like he has not gotten the production most thought, despite being one of the best receivers at beating their coverage. What are your thoughts on his development? Rob, the numbers maybe aren't where we thought it was going to be for Jackson Smith-Njigba, and yet I feel like this is a case where the numbers don't necessarily paint a perfect picture of how he's played to this point.
Well, and you said one of the key words there, and as you were explaining your answer, yet. I really think that this is going to be the opportunity. If DK Metcalf is out, and again, the question a couple of moments ago about, if the Seahawks offense remains humming, if DK Metcalf is out, then does that suggest that Seattle maybe will cut ties with number 14 and not bring him back? I think that the opposite could also be true, that DK Metcalf's stock with the Seahawks could absolutely explode if Seattle's offense does not continue to really move the ball effectively if DK Metcalf is out with that grade 1 MCL strain. They're going to be going up against a much more ferocious pass rush, albeit at home, against the Buffalo Bills here this next week. We'll see. If DK Metcalf is not on the field, then again, I think that the most logical candidate to suddenly get a whole bunch of more opportunities with the football is going to be Jackson Smith-Njigba. He's getting open, and for the most part, he is catching the ball cleanly. I think that there's every reason to believe that JSN is going to continue to be an ascending star in the NFL. I just think that right now, Ryan Grubb feels more confident in DK Metcalf, and it's easy to understand why, just because of his size, his speed. I mean, the man is unbelievable talent. But Jackson Smith-Njigba is a terrific receiver who is going to be very effective. I just think that right now the focus is on number 14 and then number 9 for, again, obvious reasons. But I do think that you're going to see Jackson Smith-Njigba continue to get better and better as the season goes on, and clearly be the number 2 receiver, perhaps at sometimes take over as the number 1 spot for Seattle's offense.
Our last question here that's coming from Giltzer tweets, how close are the Rams and Cardinals to being done? The Rams can't lose any more games. They've got the Vikings and Seahawks next, and the Cardinals are a walking mash unit. So I don't think either one of these teams is done. And the reason why I'm going to say that is look at the division standings. The Seahawks are in first place and they're 4-3. It's not like the Seahawks have a 6-1 or 7-0 record. They're barely over the 500 mark. So even though the Cardinals and Rams have both struggled, they've had their injuries. The Rams won yesterday. They beat the Raiders. So they get a victory. They're going to get Cooper Kupp back here in the next week or two. They're going to get Puka Nacua back at some point. They're going to start getting some injured players back. And so I don't think the Rams are out of it. And the Cardinals, they've had a couple of games they've lost that they easily could have won. They've been shooting themselves in the foot. I still think Arizona is a team that by the second half of the season could be pretty dangerous. They've had a few injuries too. This division right now is 1-9 against NFC teams outside of the NFC West. The only team that's won a game against a non-NFC West NFC team is the Seahawks beating the Falcons yesterday. So it has been a struggle. Every team has been dealing with injuries. The 49ers are the team that got to wonder about losing Brandon Ayuk for the season with the other injuries that they've got. But I do not think the Cardinals and Rams are done yet just because of the state of the division. If the Seahawks had won a couple more games, then maybe you start to look at it that way. But this is still a very wide open division, even with the injuries that several of these teams have had to deal with. When we come back, we're going to take an in-depth look at that exciting win in Atlanta. What went right for the Seahawks? We're going to be talking offense, defense, maybe a sprinkle of special teams as well. We'll get to that coming up next year on our Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks. NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. When you've got a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats. You can view play-by-play live and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. You'll get started with $200 of bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. You can bet on everything from Ken Walker III scoring a receiving touchdown against the Bills next weekend, or Jake Bobo being the sleeper to be the first player on Sunday to get a 30-plus yard reception. Just throw in a $5 bet and you'll get $200 in bonus bets. Just visit FanDuel.com today. Download America's #1 sportsbook. Welcome back to the Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This is your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to each and every one of the 12s out there. Thank you, as always, for tuning in and making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. The Seahawks back in the win column. It felt like it had been an eternity, but they snapped their 3-game losing streak, beat the red-hot Atlanta Falcons at their own stadium. Though I will admit, Rob, it did feel like I was at Lumen Field South for large chunks of that game yesterday. A lot of empty seats, and the Seahawk fans, as they always seem to do, traveled really well. And so by the second half, it almost felt like Lumen Field had moved to Atlanta, the way that the crowd was seemingly leaning heavily towards the Seahawks at that point. But let's get to our Monday musings, shall we? We've had a chance to revisit the film and look back at yesterday's 34-14 win over the Atlanta Falcons. And I know, sir, that we're going to get off to a quick start with this segment talking about quick starts.
Yeah, exactly. That's the thing. It was so encouraging. It's just the quick start that Seattle kind of started the game with and then maintained that momentum throughout the entire game. This was a game that I thought that both teams were going to be north of 30 points. I just saw two defenses that have been struggling a little bit, and that you had two explosive, all-pro caliber quarterbacks with dynamic running games. And, so I thought that it was important for Seattle to get off on a good start. Of course, they march all the way down the field, almost scored the opening touchdown. Of course, there was a penalty that reversed that. Still got the field goal. But still, the aggressive play calling from Ryan Grubb, the pinpoint passing that we saw from Geno Smith. To me, Corbin, this was the most complete and satisfactory, satisfying victory of the Seahawks season so far, whether it be an offense, defense, special teams, the guts to go for the long touchdown throw, of course, right before halftime, Geno Smith's precise throw, the guts to go for a 59-yard field goal by Jason Myers. I mean, 59-yard, that's the second longest of his career, the longest that he's made in 4 years. Now, obviously, we talked about before with the defense, and again, just the mixing and matching they did of the personnel along the defensive line and the blitzes that they were creating because of that. Again, it just felt like a game that the Seahawks just kind of turned up the intensity, turned up the aggression, and it wound up helping them turn up a victory as well.
To me, the other key storyline in this game, and we can look at the defensive line play, which we've already emphasized. That was a huge part of this game. And then the quick start on offense. But Seattle went into this game, they were counting on a lot of young, unproven players to step up on the road in what we thought was going to be a hostile road environment. It really was not. It was a very home-centric road game. But nonetheless, you were still playing on the road. You're still playing a Falcons team that entered this game 4-2 and had won 4 of their last 5 games. They were humming on offense. The defense was making enough stops to win games. So this was a difficult draw to just chuck a player like Mike Jarrell, who is the fourth right tackle that the Seahawks have on their depth chart, putting him in the lineup with no regular season snaps. I talked a ton in the post-game show about what he did, and The all-22 reassured what I saw. Yes, there were some mistakes, gave up a sack. But listen, there were also some really fun plays with him. The run block that led to Ken Walker III's 20-yard touchdown. Seeing it from the end zone view, it was even more exciting to see the amount of space that he created off the snap, driving that defender outside. There were a couple other plays where Geno Smith was able to maneuver the pocket, in part because Mike Jarrell got beat initially and showed off that 95th percentile athleticism to recover and get his hands on the defender so that he couldn't get to Geno Smith. There were plays that you just wouldn't see Stone Forsythe be able to physically make that Mike Jarrell was making, recovering there. But I want to focus on the defensive side of the football. Josh Jobe, who had played a handful of snaps for Philadelphia Eagles the last couple of years, former Alabama corner, had been in the practice squad for the Seahawks. The Eagles cut him at the end of training camp, had never played a game in Mike Macdonald's defense. And Kirk Cousins picked on him early and often. He was trying to test 29. He gave up a few completions this game. But, Rob, 7 targets, he gave up just 3 receptions, and he had 2 pass breakups. He had almost as many pass breakups as completions allowed. I thought he was active tackling in the run game. Didn't look like he was phased at all. You could tell he had played some regular season snaps, which he did for the Philadelphia Eagles last year. But I really, going back and watching the film, Josh Jobe was one of the 4 or 5 best defensive players for the Seahawks in this game. He was making clean tackles. He got his hands on the football multiple times. Look, if you're in a position where you have one or more of your corners that miss this game, if they have to miss more time, I think number 29 might be the next guy in line that gets a spot on your 53-man roster. That is how well he played in this game against a really good Falcons receiving core.
100% agree with you. I mean, Josh Jobe, when he entered the draft a couple of years ago, Corbin, he was my number 13th ranked cornerback. And it was only because that he suffered an injury late in the season that kept him out of the pre-draft training process, in my opinion, is why he slipped out of the draft entirely. I mean, he's a good player. I actually compared him to former Seahawk Trey Flowers. And Trey Flowers, of course, played safety at Oklahoma State before making that transition to cornerback for the Seahawks. But like Trey Flowers, Josh Jobe has long arms, as you mentioned. He's physical and run support. He played an awful lot of very good football against elite competition at Alabama. You know, he's a good player. And so I was excited to see him get the opportunity. I was confident that he would play better than some were expecting. And, again, was reassured when he did play as well as he did. Nehemiah Pritchard on the other side as well. He had some nice plays, and he showed that his length and his speed, had some misses in run defense, and that is a little disappointing, but that's something that we're going to continue to kind of talk about with him. That was one of the bugaboos in his game in the past, but still was very encouraged by the play of Seattle's 2 young corners. I want to go back to Mike Jarrell just for a moment here. You mentioned the terrific run block that sprung Kenneth Walker III for that 20-yard touchdown. I mean, that was Matt Judon that Mike Jarrell was moving around there. And he made some other terrific blocks, both in pass protection and in the running game. And I loved the quote that I read from our buddy Greg Bell at Tacoma News-Tribune that got this quote. So I don't know if this is something Mike Jarrell said to everybody, but it was certainly in Greg Bell's piece in Tacoma News-Tribune. And he basically was just kind of complimenting Mike Jarrell. And Jarrell said, "You wouldn't congratulate a fish for swimming. This is a young man that expects to have success because that 95th percentile athleticism that you acknowledged here. And so kudos to Ryan Grubb as the play caller, Geno Smith obviously is the quarterback, but Scott Huff as well for helping to develop this young man into the quality player he was. The Seahawks youth, their depth was one of the reasons why they were able to escape Atlanta with that victory. So again, that's one of the most encouraging things I thought about this football game. Is they didn't have to just rely on the superstars. The superstars played like superstars. But some of the other guys, quote unquote, also played really good football.
Leaning into our mailbag segment real quick, we didn't put any questions about the run defense in the mailbag because I thought it catered perfectly to what I observed watching the film today when I was going back and watching the All-22. We had several questions. The Falcons struggled to run the ball in the second half. Was it because they stopped running the ball, or was it because we saw legitimate improvements from Seattle's run defense? Going into the All-22, I thought yes on both fronts. That it probably has a little bit to do with everything. going back and watching the film, though, even the touchdown drive that the Falcons had to open the second half, Seattle had 3 run stops on that drive that netted 0 or negative yards. And the Falcons' 2 main running backs ran 11 times for 22 yards in the second half. That's under 2.5 yards per carry. So I felt like you saw some real true improvements from what we had seen the previous 3.5 games, because they got gashed in the first half. They gave up a ton of rushing yards. Part of that's because Bijan Robinson's an absolute stud, and he's going to make his plays. But the run defense in the second half, I thought Roy Robertson-Harris was a huge component of this because he was playing those snaps off edge, and he was setting a firm edge. He was a concrete block. They were not moving him. I felt like the linebackers did a better job in the second half of getting their run fits. I thought Kobe Bryant was a big part of it as a force defender coming up and making a number of tackles in the run game. The tackling just in general was a lot better. And I just felt like they were swarming to the ball better than they did in the first half. You add all those things together, if you are checking off those boxes, you have your run fits, you're setting the edge, and you're tackling well. If you do those 3 things, your run defense is consistently going to be rock solid, and they have just not been able to put all that together. I felt like they did in the second half. So after rewatching the film, I am much more leaning towards this was more about what the Seahawks did than what the Falcons weren't able to do when they had to start throwing the ball.
Yeah, I think that I think you did a great job of articulating that. And because it's the Seahawks versus the Falcons, I'm going to use the term flocking to the ball rather than swarming to the ball. But that's what I thought that the Seahawks did a great job of, is that because Bijan Robinson is just so incredibly elusive for a man of his size and so fast, that I think that there were a couple of times in the first half where in one-on-one, the Seahawks looked foolish. I mean, they're picking up their jockstrap off of the turf because of what Bijan Robinson was able to do. And I think that there was more of a mindset at halftime, like, hey, we truly have to swarm to the football and kind of gang tackle these running backs because they are that good. And that was one of the things that, again, was very encouraging. So I thought that the Seahawks really did swarm to the football, kind of bottled up the running backs, because then even if he was able to make one player miss, they weren't necessarily able to make 2 or 3 or 4 Seahawk defenders miss. And I think that kind of swarming mentality, I think, is just really good for what Mike Macdonald is trying to establish here in Seattle with his defense.
And it led to turnovers because at the end of the day, stuffing the run early with the lead expanding, it forced the Falcons to throw the football. They were playing catch up against Seahawks, have been doing that for the last 3 games. Finally flipped the script on the Falcons. And once they put Atlanta in that position, as Mike Macdonald said several times, you have to earn the right to rush the passer. They did in this game with the way they improved their run defense early in the second half. They forced the Falcons' hand. They had to throw the ball more than they wanted to, and that led to Boye Mafe having the opportunity for the strip sack. That led to Draymond Jones getting a sack. That led to all the pressures from Byron Murphy that led to 2 interceptions. It is truly that marriage between the front line and the back end of your defense, and you got to be able to slow down the run first and foremost to be able to open up those opportunities to rush the passer and then create those chances for your secondary guys to make plays in the football. So we saw all those dominoes finally come together. We'll see if they can do it against the Buffalo Bills. There's some very different challenges they're going to have to deal with Josh Allen, as we'll start talking about on tomorrow's show. But nonetheless, this is a really nice building block to start off with here against a very good Falcons offense. And they were able to get the run defense fixed up some of the second half. They were able to earn that right to rush the passer. And then that creates the turnovers. It's not rocket science. It's not difficult to do. It's easier said than done. But the Seahawks went out and they got it done in this football game. As always, you can follow me on X and Threads at Corbin Smith NFL. You can follow Rob at Rob Rang. Make sure to subscribe to Locked On Seahawks on YouTube and wherever you listen to your podcast to make sure you don't miss a single episode. When we come back tomorrow, it's Tell the Truth Tuesday. We'll have our final thoughts coming out of this game, and then maybe a little bit closer to look at where things stand in the NFC West as well. And then we'll turn the page. The Buffalo Bills coming to town next weekend. Our first look at Josh Allen and company. What's new for the Bills, including the new star receiver that they just added to the mix in Amari Cooper. Make sure that you're listening to the show. Thanks for tuning in today, and enjoy the rest of your Monday. Go Hawks.